The industrialized age is actually sandwiched between the 16th century and the 18th century Ottoman Empire. So, as we get into and move beyond the industrialized age into the 18th century, there is a reform in education. This period is seen as a change in education, at least in the Turkish Empire of the time. First, there was a change in military education and military schools opened. Why was this necessary? As the industrialization led to more weaponry and more use of equipment and machinery and materials, it was important to do some strategic planning. And so military schools were opened by the Turkish Empire, and children, young men at least, were provided with military education in those schools. In 1824, Al-Mahmud made primary education mandatory, which means it was compulsory. All children of primary school going age had to be in a classroom, had to be in a school. Boys, girls, didn't matter. Muslim, non-Muslim, didn't matter. Rich, poor, didn't matter. It was seen as important that all young people at least receive a primary education, which probably at the time was up to class 5. So if children had early years education, maybe a year or two, and 5 years of primary education, 6, 7 years of good education at that time was seen as a good starting point. That really was only a starting point, because after people finished their primary school, at least the boys wondered, well, what's next? Parents wondered what's next. And so middle and high schools and higher education was formed. As children moved ahead from primary to middle to secondary or high school and higher education, these things developed. And because the rulers saw this as key, because people were interested to continue learning, to continue receive better education, and if scholars were to be produced, education could not stop at class 5. Rusti, Mektepeli, Ibadi, Sultani, and Darul Fanoon. These were the Turkish names for those different schools. So from primary to middle, most went. From middle to high, most went. Higher education, some went. Because if you were a girl at that time, you were not really allowed to continue. But you could up to high school. Higher education was not yet opened. And so boys were at an advantage still, at least in higher education. But the rest was open to boys and girls. In 1856, Islahat Farmani was formed. That is, changes in education. So what people understood even at that time, and that's something that we need to learn from them, is how do you fix, how do you change, how do you modify, how often do you review curriculum, textbooks. You can't use the same curriculum for 20 years. It's obsolete. And so changes were seen as being important. Primary education was still mandatory. Rusti must exist in places with 500 houses. That's your primary schools. Idadiye must exist in places with 100 houses. That's your middle schools. Sultanis must exist in cities. That's your high schools. And Darul Fanoon, which is the university, higher education, must exist in Istanbul, which was the capital of the Turkish Empire at that time. So they really laid out how and why certain types of schools needed to show up in a particular area. Because education was compulsory, was mandatory, you could not depend on children traveling long distances or moving from one city to another in order to gain education. Male teachers and female teachers schools opened. In other words, for the first time we see teacher training, professional development for teachers, separate for male teachers, separate for female teachers. Money will be collected from the public for education. Government was not going to spend all the money. The public should also support. And so probably through taxation or some means, the money was collected from the public and education will be centralized, which means all schools will operate in the same manner. When you have central control, you can be sure that everything is happening in one way. When you don't have central control, different schools could do different things, and that would not benefit students equally. If universal education was to be provided to all children, centralized role of controlling education was important.